welcome back from lunch. This is a tough one to follow lunch, but I'm Cynthia Figge, CEO and co-founder of CSR Hub. We are a big data platform and an aggregator of global environmental, social, and governance, also known as ESG data. And I am so pleased to welcome Ilya Levtov and Sydney House. And I thought, just to get things started, if each of you would like to give a snapshot, your elevator pitch of your companies and what you do.
Hi everyone, Ilya Levtov. It's my first time at FIRE. Absolute pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me. So Craft is a supplier intelligence platform, and we structure large volumes of data and about companies all around the world and turn that into intelligence for enterprises, both in the private and public sector, who use it primarily for risk management and to develop resilience across their supply chain, but also for competitive advantage, and use the data and the intelligence to find opportunities with their supply chain and forge ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney. It's also my first year at FIRE, and thankful to be here with all of you. And CERTA is a third-party risk and orchestration platform that's able to understand and uncover risk throughout the entire life cycle of an enterprise's suppliers, third parties, contractors, and subcontractors to be able to holistically evaluate risk.
Wonderful. So we have a very small topic here, the emerging supply chain risks around the world, of which there are many. So I thought we'd kick it off and just talk about what are we referring to when we talk about these risks. And also there is, I think, a very intense focus on the supply chain now that is emerging, and so maybe some thoughts about what are the top, the World Economic Forum has identified 33 risks, but we're going to narrow it down just a little bit. And so Ilya, what would you say are the top risks that we're facing?
Well, first I'll just make the context. Why does supply chain risk matter, and how is that different from other types of risk? Depending on vertical, somewhere between 50 and 90% of what an enterprise produces is produced outside its four walls. In other words, it's made by the suppliers. Right. And so over the last, I think, 10 or 15 years, it's become, because of events, it's become clearer and clearer that there's very real risk to the entire enterprise based on something happening to its suppliers. And people have started to wake up to that and look at it in more dimensions. It's a very multidimensional problem. It originates with the most common risk of all, which is financial. Okay, let's see whether our supplier is financially stable. But then over the last few years, perhaps spurred by COVID in particular, we saw all manner of operational and logistical challenges befall our suppliers. And so a non-exhaustive list, for example, our customers are very focused on cyber risk. We've all got cyber taken care of internally, but do our suppliers? And if they get hacked, what happens to us? The geopolitical environment has brought tremendous supplier impact. Tariffs is the one that gets talked about the most, but we find its weaponization of the supply chain is bringing a tremendous risk. If you're getting product from a country with whom we might have a tense relationship, then that supply can get switched off overnight, and that's happened to a large number of companies. Climate and weather, all manner of ESG risk, which I think perhaps you are both even better equipped and you'll talk about. And last one I'll point out is that all of these risks apply not only to our direct suppliers, the so-called tier one, but then think about the suppliers of our suppliers. So tier two, tier three, and on. All of these risks apply to those just as much.
Yeah. Sydney, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you probably cover all of those, but if there are any others that you're focused on, but also just maybe where you see ESG playing into this right now, as we've kind of gone through a political backlash, and we're using new terms like sustainability and other terms that we used 20 years ago. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think Ilya did a great job covering it. But I would say in terms of ESG, for sure, even though there has been a huge backlash, especially in the United States under this administration, we're still seeing regulations go into effect. I think California, we just saw that SB 253, their own scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions will be required for any company doing business in California. And so obviously scope 3 affects the supply chain, understanding the emissions. You also are still seeing a lot of regulations in the EU, even though they've been pushed back. You have the EU's regulation on deforestation that will affect hundreds of enterprises, because many different companies are sourcing products that have commodities like soy and cocoa. And so I think we also are seeing human rights risk still as a huge issue. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is still in effect. There's tons of human rights sanctions that are going to affect and have huge consequences, and even trade bans for companies. So I think even despite the pushback, we still are seeing regulations, especially in the EU, persist, and we're still seeing reputational damage, and we're still seeing companies needing to understand risk from an environmental and social perspective in their supply chains.
With these rollbacks and the delays in CSRD and other things, have you seen, are companies, are they slowing down or stepping back, or are they, as we like to say, doing work in the quiet corner?
Yeah. I think it's more the latter, doing work in the quiet corner. Like, they're not being as public about what they're doing, but I still think we're seeing demand from companies to be able to get ready, and also just to the fact that they need a system in place that's adaptable, because they don't know if they're in scope for some of these regulations that are being pushed back and to what extent. And then going further than that, kind of to Ilya's point, having a platform that can combine ESG with financial risk, with geopolitical risk, with these other areas, because they may not want to invest in a standalone, environmental risk platform if they don't necessarily know. But I do think companies, regardless, though, we are still seeing natural disasters and the real effects of climate change. And so that too is having people have a wake-up call to that.
Right. So both of you are entrepreneurs in the data world, and I think we know that companies are providing data, so it's through surveys and through collection of data, and then there's of course third-party data. Ilya, how are you guys thinking about those two, and where are you getting the data?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I'll preface this by saying that, what a sight to behold. Here we are with this age of AI upon us. And we keep thinking back to one pretty simple maxim: the best data leads to the best AI. And so I think the data layer of any stack is sort of newly important. I feel like it went through a phase of people saying, oh, that's just commodity. Data is just commodity. And with the new wave of AI, I think it's just very clear that high quality, well-organized, structured data is absolutely key to get AI models to work effectively. So that's exciting. So just to dive a little bit deeper into what we call it our data fabric, and there's actually 3 dimensions to it, of which you mentioned 2. So where we started as a company was aggregating at high scale third-party data, external data. It came from a whole bunch of primary crawling and scraping. Think a supplier's own website and looking at its management team page and jobs page and about us page, and doing so every day to see, did anything change, and does that indicate a signal about a company? That's where we started, and at some point sort of that hit a ceiling once we're crawling every company's own website, and we started getting into their social media, from Twitter to Glassdoor and things like that. And then we started to have companies come knocking on our door and say, okay, we see that you've got some reach, and I've got a specialty data set about cyber intelligence, for example, or about an ESG dimension here. Would you like to add that to the platform? And so now we've got about 25 data partners ranging in size, but they include like stalwarts of the world like Dun & Bradstreet, and then various specialty data providers. And that's all in the third-party category. And I'll just add that we've then been working with our customers to take in what for us is first-party data. So within there, ERP or other tool, they'll have data relating to the suppliers, like what did I buy from them? Did it arrive on time? How has it performed since? And so we're layering in that first-party data, and the last part really is Sydney's, what we call second-party data, which is data that comes from the suppliers themselves, whether it's from a survey or some other mode.
Yeah. Sydney, I think you've talked a little bit about orchestration. Maybe, what does that mean?
No, it's a great point. So exactly to Ilya's point, I think a big focus of CERTA is really the supplier third-party engagement piece. So being able to collect data directly from your third parties at scale, which is very challenging to do. And a lot of companies have been doing that, prior, even large enterprises prior to working with our company in Excel spreadsheets and email or Google Forms. And so being able to have one platform to be able to do that at scale. But, there's challenges there too. That's why it's so important. And we have, data partners as well, and look at other types of data, because you can't just trust, right, what a supplier is saying about themselves. But it's still a very important source of data. I think we are seeing a lot of supplier fatigue, though. And so that's one area we've invested a lot in AI as a company, to be able to help suppliers be able to pre-fill, upload data, upload their own proprietary evidence that obviously wouldn't be shared across environments, to be able to help improve the efficiency of a survey process, because that can be quite cumbersome to ask, your thousands of suppliers to answer surveys. And so that's why we also see our customers doing it more strategically. So only like the top 20% of strategic suppliers are they going to ask for that level of information.
Right. Yeah.
Can I add something? I think Sydney makes a great point about how do you trust the data? And this has been a challenge we've been thinking about, for almost 10 years. And one of the sort of few solutions I think we've come up with to it is essentially get more data. Build in redundancy to your entire data model. And so if you're wanting to analyze the cyber posture of a supplier, don't just have one cyber data vendor that tells you they're the best cyber data vendor, but actually have three. And if all three of them agree that someone's really got an A rating, even that's not 100% fact, but that's a pretty high confidence interval. And then when you see different sources diverging in their view, well, that's an excellent flag to go in and look a bit deeper. And so we've got a lot of value out of that very intentional redundancy and layering on additional data to try and get as close as you can to the truth.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we've done at CSR Hub, very much of aggregating over the history of almost 1,000 structured sources, but expert sources, and we use algorithms to really look at moving from this somewhat chaotic and highly uncorrelated data to something that has a very rich and strong signal. So I think you can have the best data in the world, and then what? Great speech, now what? And are you in the business of helping companies understand how to use the data and actually make decisions, or are you partnering, and that's where consulting firms come in, and what's that kind of maturity? It feels a little bit like the Wild West still in supply chain work, but what's your role in that, and then how do you work with partners?
Shall I go first? Sure. Okay. Happy to. So on top of our data fabric, we have two additional layers to our offering. And the next layer up is the intelligence layer. And so that is really turning all of this data, structured, semi-structured, unstructured, from all of these multivariate sources and doing everything we can to synthesize it and turn it into the risk insight that matters for somebody, coming in at the start of their workday and needing to know something and do something within the sort of ocean of noise. So that intelligence layer, and it shows up in a module such as the aggregated risk hub. One of our customers will be able to have several thousand suppliers, maybe key suppliers to a particular product line loaded in there, and all of these risk signals across 15 dimensions is elevated into, okay, look, here's 5 issues you've got to solve right now. And even that, we're working now to bring forward even more with a kind of Gen AI summarization, like that new mode, to make it even simpler for the person to understand. Because what we've found, I think your question gets at this, it's quite difficult for a category manager to know what to do. Even when some data has been elevated above information into intelligence, what do I do now? And that's always a challenge. And we're always working to think, well, how much of that can we do as a technology company? In some places, we have absolutely partnered with consulting firms, both large and small, that bring a real human analyst muscle to the issue. And in some cases where a customer can afford to pay for that additional service, that's been a good solution. But that's something we continue to look at. And we're quite optimistic about how much an AI can really support. Think of an AI risk analyst agent, essentially. That we're excited about. The last layer on top, by the way, is the workflow. So we've got a module in Craft that's case management. And when a piece of data triggers a flag, let's say a supplier's cyber score has just suddenly dropped, and you need to know about that, you need to go investigate, we can actually kick off a case and help tackle the workflow end to end.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was great. I think to echo that, I think very similarly, we are doing a lot of work around being able to unite all the different data sources and kind of provide that single pane of glass of like dashboards and visualizations, and being able to use AI to ask questions of the data and glean additional insights to make it easier to kind of converse with the data. Kind of similarly, like we're very focused on this idea of third-party risk by exception. So, maybe across, maybe you have 20,000 suppliers, you want to just run like a financial check, a sanctions check, and you don't want a compliance manager to have to come into every single one of those workflows and manually review. And so being able to automate that process, but then when there's a flag or sanctions are uncovered, being able to alert automatically the right stakeholders internally, and then similarly to Ilya's point, being able to automate like a remediation or case management flow to go out to the right stakeholders to be able to remediate the issue. And then similarly, like leveraging, all of our data sources. So we have about 130 data partners to be able to do ongoing monitoring as well. So there's continuous reassessment of the same risks, and then only having alerts when there's a change or an issue that needs to be resolved.
One of the things, and obviously, in dealing with probably large enterprises or government that have tens of thousands of suppliers, there was a McKinsey study that said 60% of the companies they had surveyed were really only dealing with tier 1. That was all they could kind of handle. And I'm curious, what is the depth? I guess it's a bit of a maturity issue too, but what is the depth that companies are going to? How are they able to tackle? Are they looking at those top 200? Are they really trying to tackle 1,000 or 10,000? Or where are we at with that? And how important is it too? I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that it's a maturity issue, and we just see a huge range of maturity levels across enterprise and the public sector. But it's advancing rapidly, and I think there's very widespread recognition that the supply chain risk needs to be well managed now. So it's turning into kind of really large markets with high growth rates, and all of that's very exciting. What we see typically, there's a range, but companies, a large enterprise could easily have 20,000 direct suppliers in total. And what they'll probably designate is somewhere between 5 and 10% of those will have a majority of the spend and be the most strategic. So there'll be full focus on that. Then there'll be some attention to the mid, and then less to the tail, where you'll try and just automate and just catch a critical alert if it's happening. Now that's all tier one, and your question also gets to what's happening down below. Now, one person I spoke to claimed that they were doing multi-tier to 14 tiers, and I struggle with that.
I'd love to know who that is.
Sorry?
I said I'd love to know who that is.
Yeah, exactly. They shall remain nameless, but I thought 14, that's really ambitious. All the atoms in the universe and everything. But in general, it's sort of, if you can get 2 tiers down below tier 1 and get that visibility, what we've found is that's really valuable for an enterprise, because you are helping solve one key issue, which is that a key supplier you rely on is reliant on one key supplier who has a dilemma whether to serve your supplier or a competitor. Sorry, I don't know if you can follow me on that, but basically you go 2 levels down, and single sourcing, and one niche company is manufacturing, and they can either supply, Albertsons or Kroger's, but not both. Yeah. Let's put it that way. So how do you get at that problem? And that's sort of tier 2, tier 3. So we're seeing a huge amount of focus there. We think that's the right place to put focus. If we can solve the problem down to that level, then we'll get down to 14 later.
That's great. Sydney, I have a different question for you. I think, we didn't see COVID coming, and we didn't see maybe some of us saw the tariffs, but massive disruption. And how do we, risk avoidance gets tougher and tougher. It's harder to imagine what's going to emerge. Are there things that you guys are helping your clients do and think about that get them to be more ready? Because so much of this is kind of, backward looking in terms of trying to do these surveys and the time that it takes to collect the data, et cetera, and how many of the companies are small and privately held, so it's very opaque. But any thoughts on sort of adaptive risk management, or how do people anticipate?
It's a great question, because obviously a lot of what we've been talking about is a little bit more reactive, right? It takes time to engage with suppliers and to get the data. I think it's, to your point, it's become extremely important to be proactive. I think one thing we've been working a lot with our customers on is doing scenario analysis. So, you already have seen that with like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requires, physical and transition risk planning. And so being able to anticipate and use scenario analysis to anticipate different risky scenarios is one thing we've been working with customers on. I would say also I think being really proactive with our customers and instituting some sort of program to, be able to engage and directly connect with their suppliers so that they can be ready to, have those conversations when there are changes that are happening, overnight, as we're seeing right now with tariffs and the changes to tariffs that are happening. I also think just diversification. And so the more data you have on your suppliers too, the more you're able to make decisions about where you're very concentrated in terms of risk. We've already been seeing that with companies moving to a China plus one strategy and moving away from China, given the risks there. And so I think just continuing to listen to our customers and helping them uncover that data to be able to make those forward-looking decisions.
Yeah, if I can add to that, just in terms of this real goal of being proactive instead of reactive. For us, it's really one of the main reasons that we base our whole company on structured data. And in that regard, we found ourselves being quite different from, a different model that we see with supplier risk management companies, which is to be based on alerts, news alerts. A large number of companies really built their model on the notion that if there's a fire at a factory in this region of this country, that's going to get written about in a newspaper, and the alert's going to come and let you know that your supplier is at risk. And the big problem with that is that it already happened. And typically you're hearing about it far too late. And not that we've got a crystal ball, to be clear, but when you stack up this amount of data and structure, what we've been able to see is really, really interesting patterns. Patterns, for example, looking tiny signals, looking across social media signal, changes in hiring behavior of a supplier, changes in management turnover, the appearance of a court filing, in some obscure registry. And you just piece those signals together and you've got a reason to go take a look.
Yeah.
And then when you go take a look, that's when you actually discover that there's something you need to plan ahead for.
Yeah. Excellent. So we're down now to 4 minutes. So if you have some questions, and I have one for you if people are making their way. Any success stories? Someone you want to talk about, a client or a company that you feel has really done a great job, has gone the distance in terms of the learning curve.
Sure, I can go with one. So more recently, I was working with a Fortune 500 CPG company, and they were basically trying to understand the full chain of custody of their pet food, to understand like what countries those different commodities had come from, and they were running that whole process via Excel spreadsheets. And so it was super challenging process. There were tons of data errors, and so it was a really collaborative effort that was super interesting, because also this company is like very passionate. Like, they weren't just doing this from a risk perspective, but their leadership actively really cares about the environment. It's a family-run business. They want this to be alive for generations to come, which is quite cool to see that. And so throughout this process, working with this customer, we are able to take all of their kind of combined, to some of Ilya's points, like their first party data from their ERP system, with structuring, basically a massive survey as well within our platform to be able to survey their tier 1 and 2 suppliers and collect basically the geo coordinates of the origins of these raw materials that are in scope for regulations like the EU's deforestation regulation, and then use, third-party data providers like satellite imagery to be able to validate that those geocoordinates that we needed to use to engage with suppliers with weren't coming from areas at risk of deforestation. And then, taking all those insights and actually working with their sustainability teams to basically change the formulations of their products to basically help them decrease emissions and also cut down on deforestation. And so that was just a really cool project that, made it really exciting to do what I do every day.
Cynthia, I'll be very brief and then let's take the question. One of our great success stories is the federal government. Surprised to say it, but delighted. 20 agencies at the DoD are making fantastic use and uncovering real risks and issues in their supply chain using craft.
Wonderful. Okay.
Tom Mitchell. Just wanted to know how you handle sort of data integrity when both parties involved may not want to know the truth. So Cobalt Red is a book by Siddharth Kara, and he basically talks about the Congo brings 40% of all cobalt to the world's supply. And his contention after visiting the Congo was that no cobalt supply is immune from child labor. And so he says Apple doesn't want to know about it. The mining companies definitely don't want to know about it. And there's all these middlemen who are basically, washing the source of the cobalt. And so how is that handled, and what are ways of attacking that in the future?
It's a really great question, and it's something that we're seeing more and more of, and working on more and more projects related to trying to trace forced labor and human rights risks down multiple tiers of the supply chain, which is obviously very, very, very difficult. The approaches that we have taken have been a combination of using different data partners, basically that already have relationships with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, customs databases, bill of lading data, trade databases to be able to understand ports of where trade is happening. But to your point about like when there's no acknowledgement or like that's not acknowledged by governance or NGOs or anything. I mean, that's quite difficult. So I feel like we kind of go off of what we can based on the records we have, and then being able to also rely on surveys as well. But it's not perfect, and it's something that needs to be continuously invested in and a problem to solve.
Thank you. Sorry, time is up, but thank you, Ilya, and thank you, Sydney.